You were lied to your entire life. The history textbooks we studied from, the films we watched, even the memorials where we lay flowers, all of it is part of a grand stage set. Have you ever noticed how the official version of the War of 1812 starts to fall apart the moment you look closely at the details? We are told about a great confrontation, about a clash of two emperors, about patriotism and a burned Moscow. But what if I told you that Napoleon Bonaparte and Alexander I were not enemies? What if this war was not an invasion at all, but a joint punitive operation? An operation aimed at clearing territories of the remnants of a civilization that today is commonly called Great Tartaria. Get ready, because today we are going to dismantle the very foundation of what you thought was the truth. Let's start with a simple fact that historians carefully ignore or dismiss as a strange fashion of the time. Take a look at the uniforms. If you take portraits of officers from the French and Russian armies of that period, remove the captions, and mix them up, even a professional historian would struggle to tell who is who. The same epaulets, the same shakos, the same cut, the same colors. We are told this is just fashion borrowing. Seriously? During a total war of annihilation, the armies are dressed almost identically. Imagine if during World War II Soviet soldiers and Wehrmacht soldiers had worn the same uniforms, differing only in minor details. That would be absurd. Yet in 1812, for some reason, this is considered normal. And what about the language? The Russian nobility spoke French better than their native Russian. They thought in French, wrote love letters in French, and gave orders in French. They try to explain this as cultural influence. But think logically. You are at war with an enemy, yet you speak his language, dress like him, and live by his cultural codes. Doesn't that look more like a civil war within a single global system? Or, even more frightening, like the actions of a unified coalition army against some third force? Remember the Treaty of Tilsit in 1807. Official history tells us it was a forced alliance. But take a look at the medals issued in honor of that event. On them, the profiles of Napoleon and Alexander are placed side by side, like the profiles of two co-rulers, two brothers in arms. On some medallions, they are literally looking in the same direction. Symbolism at that time carried enormous weight. No one would ever mint the profile of an enemy next to their own unless there were a real, deep alliance. There is a theory, and it is gaining more and more supporting evidence, that by the beginning of the 19th century, Europe had already been captured by new elites, representatives of that very parasitic system that still rules the world today. Alexander and Napoleon were the managers of this redistribution of power. Their task was not to destroy each other, but to sweep through with fire and sword the lands that still remained loyal to the old empire. The very empire that maps labeled as Grand Tartary or Great Tartaria, whose cities once stood where today we see ruins and wastelands. Let's turn to logistics. This is the area where official history completely collapses. We are told that Napoleon's Grand Army numbered around 600,000 men. 600,000. Can you even imagine that number in the realities of the early 19th century? No railways, no motor transport, no canned food, no modern food preservation technologies. What did they eat? Historians talk about foragers and supply trains, but let's do the math. A horse consumes a fixed amount of oats and hay every day. To feed an army of 600,000 men and hundreds of thousands of horses would require a continuous flow of supplies, something physically impossible to maintain on the dirt roads of that era, especially under the conditions of the Russian mud season. Eyewitnesses of those events, in their memoirs, often contradict themselves, describing moments of perfect order followed by total chaos. But they never give a clear answer to the question of supply. But what if the army did not march on foot all the way from Paris? What if the logistics were supported by technologies that were later removed and forgotten? Or, more likely, what if the troops were already on the territory, quartered in captured cities, and the so-called invasion was merely a regrouping of forces for the final strike on Moscow? And here we arrive at the most interesting question of all. Who was this we're really being fought against? Look at Napoleon's route. It is a narrow spear thrust straight into the heart of the country, toward Moscow. He did not try to occupy the south. He did not move on St. Petersburg, where Alexander was based. Why Moscow? We are told it was to force peace. But St. Petersburg was the capital. Capturing the old capital did not have the strategic importance attributed to it. unless the goal was to destroy something or someone located precisely there. Moscow was not just a city of merchants and boyars. Moscow was the last stronghold of a force that answered neither to St. Petersburg nor to Paris. It was the center of the old world. And that is exactly why two armies, formally at war with each other, were in reality driving the population and the defenders of Tartaria into this cauldron. Did you ever notice how strangely Kutuzov behaved? He kept retreating, giving up positions, avoiding decisive battles, as if deliberately letting Napoleon pass. The official version calls this a brilliant tactical maneuver, but an alternative perspective suggests something very different. Kutuzov and his generals were maintaining a corridor. They were not defending Moscow. They were escorting the French army to its destination, so that, through French hands, or more precisely through the hands of a united European coalition, what the Russian army could not do itself for ideological reasons would be carried out: the destruction of the ancient capital along with its people and its history. Look at the maps of that era. As late as the end of the 18th century, the British Encyclopedia plainly describes Great Tartary as a vast state bordering Muscovy. And then suddenly, in the early 19th century, this country disappears from political maps, remaining only as a geographical term. Where did the millions of people go? Where did the cities marked on old globes go? They could not simply vanish. They had to be physically destroyed. The War of 1812 fits perfectly into this puzzle as the final phase of that cleansing. This was a genocide disguised as an invasion. We were taught to take pride in this war. It was labeled patriotic, so that we would never suspect that our ancestors might not have been victors, but victims of a global conspiracy. And this is only the beginning. Next, we will talk about what really happened in Moscow and why the fire described to us looks far more like the use of weapons of mass destruction than an ordinary blaze of wooden houses. Technologies that we are told appeared only in the 20th century left their radioactive trace on 19th century stone. But first, let us focus on the event that became the culmination of this strange war: the fire of Moscow. Official history feeds us a primitive tale that the city was set ablaze by its own residents or by saboteurs acting on the orders of Count Rostofan. We are told that Moscow was wooden and therefore burned like a matchstick. But this is a brazen lie, aimed at those who have never taken an interest in early 19th century architecture. By that time, Moscow was a city of stone palaces, brick manufactories, and monumental cathedrals. Yes, there were wooden buildings, but they were located on the outskirts. The city center, the Kremlin, the noble estates, all of this was stone. Brick does not burn. Stone does not burn. To make a stone city blaze so fiercely that bells melted in their bell towers requires temperatures unattainable through ordinary wood fires. The melting point of bronze is around 1,000 degrees Celsius. To reduce brick walls to rubble and melt granite embankments, you need a thermal shock of colossal power. Read the memoirs of French officers, for example, those of Count de Segur. He describes not just a fire. He describes an ocean of flame that behaved like a living organism. Eyewitnesses speak of flashes of light that illuminated the night sky brighter than the sun. What kind of sun can we be talking about when barns are burning? This kind of description is characteristic of the light radiation produced by a nuclear or other high-technology explosion. Moreover, the fire spread against the wind. This is a physical anomaly if we are talking about an ordinary fire, but a perfectly explainable phenomenon if we are dealing with plasma weapons or carpet bombing. Yes, you heard that right. Who could have delivered such a strike? A third force: those who controlled both Napoleon and Alexander. The objective was to erase the material culture of Tartaria, to destroy archives, libraries, and technologies stored in Moscow's underground vaults. Now let's look at the consequences of this so-called fire. What happened to Napoleon's great army? We are told the answer was General Frost. Supposedly, the French, who had conquered all of Europe, simply forgot to bring warm clothing and froze to death. That is laughable. Climate records from those years show that the winter of 1812 arrived later than usual, and the severe frosts hit only after the army had already turned into a mass of wrecked, starving men. So what were they actually dying from? The symptoms described by regimental doctors are horrifying: hair loss, skin ulcers, vomiting, diarrhea, disorientation. Soldiers went mad. Their teeth fell out. Historians call it typhus or some unknown fever. But any modern radiologist would tell you this is the classic picture of acute radiation sickness. Napoleon's army entered a kill zone. They remained in the radioactive ash of Moscow for more than a month. They drank contaminated water. They breathed radioactive dust. That is why the Great Army simply dissolved. They did not freeze. They disintegrated at the cellular level. Look at Russia's demographic data after the war. Official statistics record a strange collapse. In some provinces that the troops never even passed through, the population dropped by tens of percent. Why? Because a radioactive cloud does not recognize borders. Fallout after the strike on Moscow covered vast territories. In villages and rural settlements, people died entire families at a time from what was then called the pestilence. But this was not an infection, it was a radiation catastrophe. And the authorities knew it perfectly well. That is precisely why a total reconstruction of Moscow began immediately after the war. The Commission for the Construction of Moscow, established in 1813, worked at a suspiciously rapid pace. Within just a couple of years, the city quite literally rose from the ashes. Where did the resources come from? Where did millions of bricks come from if the factories were destroyed? Where did thousands of skilled stonemasons come from if the male population had been decimated by the war? The answer is simple. They were not building, they were digging things out. They were restoring what had survived and burying under soil what had been too badly damaged. Moscow's so-called cultural layer is not the result of centuries of accumulated dust. It is meters of earth deliberately poured over the first floors of buildings to conceal the traces of the catastrophe and the irradiated ruins. We are walking on the rooftops and second floors of that pre-flood Moscow. The Polytechnic Museum, the excavations at Lubyanka, everywhere we see full-fledged floors buried deep underground, complete with windows and doors. Who builds windows underground? No one. These were first floors that became basements after the Great Burial. Another fact that continues to trouble researchers is the absence of mass horse burials. 600,000 men, hundreds of thousands of horses. Where are their bones? Archaeologists find only isolated burials. If the army had died from cold and starvation, the entire road from Moscow to the Berezina should be paved with bones. But they are not there. So where did the bodies go? The cremation theory does not withstand criticism under those conditions. There was not even enough firewood for heating. What if the bodies simply vaporized at the epicenters of explosions? Or were disposed of by special cleanup teams using chemical agents unknown to us? We are dealing with a crime on a planetary scale, the traces of which have been systematically erased for 200 years. Pay attention to the medals for the capture of Paris and for the salvation of the fatherland. They often depict a strange triangle with an eye, the all-seeing eye, a Masonic symbol. It is everywhere, on the pediments of buildings restored after the fire, on ceremonial weapons, on state seals of that era. This is the signature of the client. Napoleon and Alexander were high-ranking Freemasons, executors of the will of a global lodge. Their correspondence, if read between the lines, is full of hints about the great work and the transformation of the world. The war was a ritual, a sacrifice. Millions of lives were laid on the altar of a new world order, one in which there was no place for Tartaria or the Vedic worldview. Ask yourself, why does Europe, after 1815, enter an era of reaction and the creation of the Holy Alliance? It was the formation of a world government, a prototype of the European Union and the Alliance. They united not to prevent new wars, but to control the captured territories and to prevent the revival of the destroyed civilization. All of 19th century history is a process of rewriting the past. Special commissions were sent to monasteries and archives to confiscate chronicles, rewrite books, and destroy maps. We were given and invented ancient history. Events were pushed back thousands of years to fill the void left after the purge of the real past. We live inside a matrix created at the beginning of the 19th century, and the War of 1812 is the 0 point of that matrix. But the most terrifying evidence is hidden not in archives, but in the forests. Look at the age of forests in Russia and Europe. You will not find trees older than 200 years. Why? Go into the forest and look around. Do you see giant trees that are 300, 400, 500 years old? No. Across central Russia and across Europe as well, forest growth is strangely uniform. Pines and birches stand as if selected by size, all of roughly the same diameter. If you cut one of these trees and count the rings, you will rarely find more than 150 or 200. This is a biological fact that cannot be dismissed. Official science explains this with industrial logging and localized fires. But wait, did they really cut down absolutely everything, down to the last sapling, simultaneously across a vast territory from Paris to the Urals? That would have been technically impossible at the time. They had no chainsaws, no logging machinery. The only logical explanation is the total destruction of the biosphere. A planetary fire, or a shock wave that wiped out centuries-old forests, leaving behind a scorched wasteland where new growth began only in the mid-19th century. We are living in a young forest that grew on the bones of the previous world. Old photographs from the late 19th century confirm this. In them, we see barren landscapes without a single tree in places where dense taiga roars today. Now open satellite maps. Look at the strange round lakes scattered across the Tver and Ryazan regions, across Belarus and Ukraine. There are thousands of them, perfectly round craters filled with water. Geologists mutter something about karst sinkholes or meteor showers. But meteorites do not fall in clusters forming tactical lines of defense. And karst sinkholes do not create perfect circles with raised rims of displaced earth. These are blast craters. If you overlay a map of these lakes with the route of Napoleon's army and the deployment zones of Russian forces, you will see a chilling overlap. Combat operations were conducted using weapons of such destructive power that the land itself was turned into a sieve. This was carpet bombing, the traces of which were hidden from us under the guise of natural landscapes. Who could have attacked from the air in 1812? The answer to that question will shatter your understanding of reality. And what exactly were they bombing? Look at the city plans of that era. Almost all major cities in Europe and Russia were surrounded by, or built within, so-called star forts. Stars, bastions. Historians insist these were fortifications designed to defend against cannons and infantry. But this is a lie that falls apart at the first serious engineering analysis. The complex star geometry offers no real advantage under artillery fire. On the contrary, it creates blind zones and complicates defense. But from the standpoint of wave physics, this shape is ideal. These were gas distribution hubs, power stations, space harmonizers of Great Tartaria. Napoleon and Alexander were not marching to conquer cities. They were marching to shut down a life support system. They were dismantling the planet's energy framework. That is why so many star forts after the War of 1812 were razed to the ground, with parks laid out in their place or prisons built on their foundations. Power was erasing free energy technologies in order to put humanity on the needle of hydrocarbons and primitive manual labor. Now connect the facts. The destruction of forests, the gigantic fires that consumed cities, the bombardment of vast territories. What happens when millions of tons of dust, ash, and soil are thrown into the atmosphere? Mud rains begin. And here we arrive at the solution to the so-called mud flood. This was not a global flood in the biblical sense. It was a direct consequence of the war. Soil blasted into the air by explosions settled back down for years. It buried the first floors of surviving buildings, altered riverbeds, and covered roads and bridges. The 3 to 4 meter clay layers found in excavations all over the world are sedimentary deposits from that very catastrophe. People who survived the slaughter were forced to dig out their homes, turn second-floor windows into doors, and start life anew in a world that had become gray, filthy, and cold. Official history calls this a cultural layer. But any builder will tell you, a cultural layer does not grow meters thick per century, evenly across an entire city, sealing windows and doors. And here the most tragic chapter of this purge opens. Where did the children go? In the mid-19th century, the world was flooded by an unprecedented wave of orphanhood. Mysterious orphan trains appeared in the United States of America. Massive foundling homes were established across Russia and Europe. Where did hundreds of thousands of homeless children come from simultaneously in every country? Where were their parents? Why is the theme of orphanhood one of the most dominant in the literature of that era? Think of Dickens. Think of Dostoevsky. The answer is terrifying. The adult population, the carriers of memory and skills, was wiped out during a war catastrophe. Children were taken away, their memory of the past erased. given new, simple surnames, Ivanov, Petrov, Smith, Jones, and educated under new, primitive programs. They were molded into ideal slaves for the new industrial revolution. They were handed a truncated history, an invented chronology, and taught that their ancestors were savages living in dugouts by the light of burning splinters. We are the descendants of those orphans, raised among the ruins of a great civilization we were forbidden to remember. Ask yourself why, at the beginning of the 19th century, there is a sudden collapse in technology. Unique stone artifacts, the vases of the Hermitage, the Alexander Column, St. Isaac's Cathedral, all supposedly created in an age of chisels and hammers. Yet we cannot reproduce them today, even with modern CNC machines. The masters of the past possessed technologies for casting stone, processing granite as if it were clay, creating geopolymer concrete. And then, a sudden break. We regress to crooked brickwork and primitive steam engines whose efficiency is inferior even to ancient mechanisms. This was technological degradation. We were thrown back hundreds of years in development. The War of 1812 became the boundary after which humanity forgot how to fly in vimanas and how to draw electricity from the atmosphere using temple domes. Napoleon did not take gold and furs out of Moscow. He removed and destroyed blueprints, instruments, and manuscripts. The convoys of plunder that allegedly vanished along the way actually reached their destination, but their contents were locked away in secret vaults of the Vatican and London, far from the eyes of ordinary people. Look at the paintings of the ruinist artists of that era: Hubert Robert, Giovanni Piranesi, and hundreds of lesser-known figures. Official scholarship tells us these were fantasies, a strange romantic fascination with ancient ruins, capriccios. But look closely. They were painting from life. They were war correspondents and documentarians of that catastrophe. On their canvases, we see not imagined worlds, but reality immediately after the war. We see cyclopean arches shattered, colonnades buried in mud, trees growing directly from rooftops. And below, among these majestic ruins, tiny human figures scurry about, ragged people cooking over campfires in the middle of palace halls, grazing goats on the fragments of ancient statues. These people did not build these structures. They could not have done so, technically. They simply moved into them, the way ants move into a house abandoned by an elephant. And that is us. We are a civilization of squatters, occupiers who took over someone else's palaces after the Great Purge. Walk through the historic center of St. Petersburg. Go up to the doors of St. Isaac's Cathedral or the Winter Palace. Look at the door handles. They are at the level of your head, or even higher. Look at the stair steps. They are too tall and awkward for a normal human stride. The ceiling heights in old buildings are 4 to 5 meters. The windows are so large that a single person cannot open them alone. Why? We are told it was for grandeur, for imperial pomp. That is nonsense. Architecture is always utilitarian and functional. These buildings were not designed for us. They were designed for people 2.5 to 3 meters tall. These were the homes of Atlanteans, the inhabitants of that very Tartaria, whose physical parameters were different from ours. The War of 1812 was not merely a redrawing of borders. It was a war between biological species, a war of short but numerous invaders against a small yet highly developed race of giants. And the giants did not lose in open battle. They were destroyed by a treacherous strike using weapons of mass destruction that erased their cities from the face of the earth. Think of the Alexander Column. 600 tons of monolithic granite. A perfectly polished shaft. We are told a childish fairy tale that simple Russian peasants in bast shoes, living on bread and water, carved and raised this colossus by hand using ropes and logs. But any modern engineer who works with heavy loads will tell you this is technically impossible. Without powerful hydraulics, without cranes of sufficient lifting capacity, erecting such a monolith vertically cannot be done. And the processing? The column has perfect rotational geometry. To shape granite like this, you need a gigantic lathe and cutting tools stronger than diamond. Where's that machine? Where are the tools? They are gone, because they were confiscated. The technologies of that era surpassed our modern capabilities. We still cannot reproduce the polygonal masonry of Kronstadt. where enormous granite blocks are fitted together without mortars so precisely that a knife blade cannot slip between them. These are traces of machine processing, traces of lasers, plasma cutting, and milling, not the work of a serf with a chisel. We were handed a primitive version of history, so we would not ask questions. We live inside stage scenery, and the entire history of the 19th century is stitched together with white thread to conceal the fact of a monstrous degradation. We were given a smoking steam locomotive with a 5% efficiency rate and told it was the pinnacle of progress. Even though just yesterday our ancestors may have been using atmospheric electricity and traveling through portals. We walk streets whose names were changed and live in cities whose foundations remember entirely different masters.